Ukraine, they're losing 26,000 soldiers a month. Can you believe it? A month, 26,000 young.
It appears that Vladimir Putin believes that he can still achieve his objectives on the battlefield. And so the Russians have continued to press their military campaign. But I would note that over the last 2 years, Russia's captured about 2% of Ukraine's territory. Today, Russia occupies about 19% of Ukraine. That's actually 1/3 less than they occupied back in March of 2022. And to capture that 2% over the past 2 years, the Russians have paid a horrific price in terms of casualties. But still, Putin continues to press on this campaign. The Ukrainians, however, have shown, I think, great resilience in resisting and are making the Russians pay for the land that the Russians capture. You had the meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky, and it looks like progress is being made towards consolidating a position that would be agreed by the Americans, the Ukrainians, and the Europeans. I believe that President Zelensky said it's about 90% agreed now, and then that would be a package presumably presented to the Russians. Unfortunately, I think that there are big differences between the package that was discussed between President Zelensky and President Trump and what the Russians will want. If you look over the past year, you've seen, I think, significant movement by the Ukrainians. And as painful as it will be, I think Ukrainians are now prepared to accept the loss of some territory on a de facto basis. However, on the Russian side, you've seen absolutely no movement. When Russian officials such as Foreign Minister Lavrov talk about Russian demands, it's the same demands the Russians have been asking for the last 2 or 3 years. And so at some point, if the mediation effort is to be successful, I believe that President Trump needs to join with the West in putting greater pressure on Moscow. And that would include things like tightening sanctions on Russia, in particular, reducing the oil revenues that Russia accrues from selling its oil abroad, tightening sanctions to reduce the leakage of Western high technology into Russia, which is then used in Russian weapons to strike Ukraine. It would mean the West providing the funds and the resources that Ukraine needs to continue to arm its military, and it would mean providing more sophisticated weapons to the Ukrainians. There are a number of things that I think the West, in particular Washington, could do that would have a chance of affecting the calculation in Moscow and perhaps might persuade the Russians to adopt a more compromising attitude towards reach a settlement. I think a negotiated settlement is possible if there is pressure on Moscow to get Moscow to move off of its demands. And Moscow's demands right now really amount to capitulation by Ukraine, which the Ukrainians will not accept. And so there needs to be that pressure to persuade Putin that he cannot achieve his goals on the battlefield, and that if he continues to try, he will fail and continue to pay greater political, military, and economic costs. That might make a negotiation possible. It seems to me that the two key issues between Moscow and Kyiv now are the question of territory, and I do believe that under some conditions, the Ukrainians are prepared to accept some de facto loss of territory. But in return, the Ukrainians want to get very strong security guarantees from the West, because what the Ukrainians don't want to do is settle the war now and then give the Russians 2 or 3 years so that Moscow can rebuild its military capabilities and then have another war 2 or 3 years down the road. The Ukrainians want, understandably, they want to have confidence that an agreement in fact will mean a settlement, not simply a postponement of the war by 2 or 3 years. So I think you can see the Ukrainians are moving towards some middle ground, but unfortunately, there's been no movement yet by the Kremlin, and until that happens, a negotiating settlement will not be possible.